The prairie was cruel in winter, a wide and empty plain where the wind carried no mercy. It whistled across the bare land, rattling the loose boards of the cabin where Sophie sat with her children. Her hands, once soft and delicate when she had been a bride, were raw and chapped from the cold. 30 years old, though the hard years had made her look older, she pulled her shawl tighter and listened to the hollow sound of her children's hunger. It had been 5 years since her husband, Daniel, had been lowered into the dry earth on the edge of town. He had been a strong man, broad-shouldered and quick with a smile, working long hours in the fields until fever took him in a single cruel week. His passing had left Sophie alone with 3 children and no steady income, and the world had not paused to pity her. Clara, the eldest at 9, tried to carry herself like an adult. She sat by the fire pit where only ash smoldered, hugging her knees to her chest. Her eyes, dark like her father's, studied her brother and sister with a seriousness no child should carry. She had been skipping her share of what little food there had been, trying to give it to them. Beside her, Rose, just 6, leaned against her sister's shoulder. Her face was pale, cheeks sunken, but there was still a spark in her gaze. Rose was the dreamer, always speaking of warmer days, of flowers that would bloom come spring even when the ground outside was nothing but frozen earth. She whispered to Clara that things would get better, though her thin frame betrayed how close she was to giving in to hunger. And then there was Tommy. Only 4. The boy's eyes were round with confusion more than fear. Hunger gnawed at him, yet he did not understand why there was no bread, no milk, no warm stew simmering on the hearth like before. He tugged at his mother's skirts every so often, asking in his small, broken way for food, for something, anything, to fill the emptiness in his belly. Sophie would pull him into her arms, pressing her lips to his unwashed hair, though her heart broke with every question she could not answer. The cabin was nearly bare now. Once Daniel's tools had lined the walls, a small pride for a working man. But over the years, Sophie had sold or traded nearly everything for sacks of flour, for beans, for a few coins to pay debts. Now only splintered furniture and the children's threadbare blankets remained. The wind whistled through cracks in the wall, biting cold against their skin. Sophie sat at the wooden table, staring down at her hands. They trembled from weakness as much as from the cold. Her gaze fell to the small gold ring on her finger. The wedding band Daniel had slipped there a decade ago beneath a clear sky and a preacher's solemn words. It had been her last treasure, the one thing she could never bear to part with. It was more than gold. It was memory. It was the warmth of Daniel's hand, the sound of his laugh, the promise that they would always face life together. But Daniel was gone, and the children were starving. Her chest ached as she turned the ring with her thumb. She remembered the day he had given it to her, how young she had been, how beautiful she had felt, the town gathering to see them wed. She had worn it proudly, through seasons of joy and sorrow, through childbirth and sleepless nights, through years of struggle. And now, in the quiet of a cabin where no fire burned, she realized it was the only thing left worth trading. Clara looked up and caught the expression on her mother's face. "Mama?" she asked, her voice cautious. Sophie quickly wiped at her eyes and forced a smile, though the effort only deepened the lines of exhaustion around her mouth. "It's nothing." "Darling?" Sophie whispered, though in her heart she knew it was everything. She rose from the table, the floorboards creaking beneath her weight. Outside, the wind howled like a beast hungry for flesh. Sophie wrapped the shawl tighter and looked at her children one by one. Clara's watchful eyes, Rose's fragile hope, Tommy's innocent hunger. They were her world, what remained of her world. Her hand closed over the ring. She slipped it from her finger slowly, as though removing a piece of herself. The metal was cold, heavier than it had ever felt before. She held it in her palm, staring down at it as tears blurred her vision. Tomorrow, she decided, she would take it into town. She would go to the ranch at the edge of the prairie, where she had heard a man named Jackson lived alone with more land than he could work. Perhaps he would buy it, perhaps not. But she had to try. She could not let her children fade away before her eyes. Sophie closed her fist around the ring and whispered to herself, to Daniel's memory, to the silence of the room, "Forgive me, love. I cannot keep it, not when they need me more than you ever could." And with that vow, she sank into the chair again, clutching the ring, listening to her children's shallow breathing, and waiting for the dawn that would carry her toward desperate hope. The sun dipped low across the horizon, spilling long shadows across the open prairie. At the edge of that endless land sat a lonely ranch. Weathered fences, a broad barn, and a modest house of timber and stone that seemed to lean into the wind. Smoke curled weakly from the chimney, though inside there was little warmth beyond the steady rhythm of one man's routine. Jackson Cole was 30, though his face bore the rough marks of a life lived harder than his years. His broad shoulders and strong hands told of endless labor, and his eyes, gray as a storm on the plains, spoke of solitude. For years he had worked this land alone, mending fences, tending cattle, rising with the dawn and ending each day in silence. Once, long ago, Jackson had not been alone. His parents had carved this ranch out of wild earth with grit and determination, raising him to believe that family was the only wealth worth keeping. But cholera had swept through when he was just a boy, leaving him with graves to tend and land to manage on his own. He had grown into a man without siblings, without kin, hardened by work but softened by the ache of absence. That evening he sat at his table with a plate of beans and cornbread. The fire popped quietly in the hearth and the ticking of an old clock filled the silence. Outside, the prairie wind pressed against the shutters, rattling them like the fingers of a restless spirit. Jackson chewed slowly, his thoughts drifting. He often wondered if this was the way his whole life would pass. Days filled with work, nights filled with nothing but quiet. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, barely heard over the wind, then firmer, 3 knocks against the wood. Jackson frowned. Visitors were rare, especially at dusk, and rarer still in the cold. He rose from the table, setting down his fork, and crossed the room. When he pulled open the door, the last light of the sun framed a figure trembling in the chill. Sophie stood there, her shawl pulled tight, her eyes weary but steady. Behind her, 3 small shapes huddled close, Clara, Rose, and Tommy, their faces pale and frightened. The sight of them struck Jackson like a hammer to the chest. A mother and her children hollow-eyed from hunger, braving the cold in desperation. Her voice shook, but her words were clear. "My kids haven't eaten in 3 days. Would you buy my wedding ring?" She opened her palm and there it lay, a thin band of gold catching the fading light. Jackson's eyes dropped to it, then rose to her face. He saw the shame she carried in offering it, the strength it took to stand there despite the weight of her pride. He felt the ache of her desperation, but also the quiet dignity she refused to surrender. For a moment, he said nothing. His throat tightened, words caught between refusal and compassion. He had lived so long with silence that speaking felt foreign. He thought of his own mother, the way she had once held him close when the cupboards were bare. He thought of the years he had eaten alone at this very table, the empty chair across from him. Sophie mistook his silence for rejection. Her lips trembled, and she closed her hand over the ring, preparing to turn away into the cold. "Please," she whispered. "Anything you can spare. Wait." His voice was low, rough from disuse. He cleared his throat, steadying it. "You don't need to sell that ring." "Not to me," she looked up, startled. Jackson stepped aside, opening the door wider. "Come in, you and the children. It's too cold to be out here." Hesitant, Sophie glanced back at Clara, then down at Tommy clinging to her skirts. Slowly, she guided them forward. The children shuffled into the warmth of the fire, their eyes widening at the simple sight of food on the table. Jackson moved quickly, pulling out chairs, setting down extra plates. He ladled beans onto each, sliced cornbread, and poured what milk he had left into cups. The children fell on the food like sparrows, whispering thanks between bites. Jackson stood for a moment, watching them eat, a strange tightness in his chest. Sophie remained standing, her hands twisting in her shawl. "You're kind," she said softly, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "But I will repay you somehow. I can work, clean, whatever you need." Jackson shook his head. "Eat first, rest, we'll talk later." She lowered herself into the chair at last, eyes shining with unshed tears. He noticed the way she carried herself, tired but proud, worn down by grief but unbroken. In her presence, the house felt different, warmer, as though the long silence of his life had been broken not by noise, but by the sound of hearts beating together in one room. Jackson sat back down, his gaze lingering on Sophie as she helped her children. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the weight of loneliness pressing on him. Instead, he felt something else, something he had long thought buried in the dust of his past: hope. The morning after Sophie and her children arrived, the world beyond Jackson's ranch had vanished beneath white. Heavy snow fell through the night, piling against the fences and burying the prairie in silence. By dawn, the storm was still raging, wind howling across the land like a wild animal, snow driving against the windows in waves. The ranch, once so lonely in its openness, now felt like a fragile island in an endless sea of white. Jackson stood at the window, arms folded across his chest, watching the snow swirl. He had seen storms like this before, storms that swallowed travelers whole, storms that closed the roads for weeks. He turned back toward the fire where Sophie sat with her children, and for the first time he felt grateful for the storm. Grateful that it would keep them here, with him, if only for a little while. The cabin had come alive in a way Jackson could hardly recognize. Last night the children had eaten until their bellies were full, their cheeks flushed with warmth. Now they sat on the rug near the fire, playing with the few scraps of wood Jackson offered them, pretending they were soldiers and horses. Tommy laughed, a small, high laugh that rang like a bell, and Jackson's chest tightened at the sound. How long had it been since such laughter had filled these walls? Too long. Clara, always watchful, had taken charge of her brother and sister, arranging their game so they wouldn't quarrel. She glanced at Jackson now and then with the wary look of a child who had grown up too fast, as if weighing whether this man could be trusted. Rose, more fragile, curled against her mother's side, humming softly to herself, though her eyes followed the flames as if they promised a better tomorrow. Sophie sat in the rocking chair near the hearth, mending one of Rose's dresses with a careful hand. Her hair, dark with streaks of chestnut, fell loose around her shoulders, the firelight catching it in strands of copper. There was tiredness in her eyes, yet also relief. Relief that her children were fed, warm, safe for the moment. Still, Jackson saw the shadow of guilt beneath her calm. She had come here to sell her wedding ring, the last piece of her husband, and instead found shelter. That conflict lingered in the downward curve of her mouth, in the way she held herself as though she did not deserve the comfort she'd been given. Jackson busied himself in the kitchen corner, splitting kindling, boiling coffee, mending tools that needed fixing. Yet his eyes returned again and again to the scene by the fire. Something stirred in him, something he had long thought buried with the past. He remembered his mother's hands, rough but gentle, guiding his across a Bible. He remembered his father's laughter, the sound of it filling this very house as they ate supper together. Those memories had lived only as ghosts for years. But now, watching Sophie with her children, he could almost feel them breathe again. That night, as the storm beat harder against the walls, the cabin glowed golden with firelight. The children, drowsy after another meal, lay bundled together beneath blankets. Rose's small hand clutched Tommy's, and Clara whispered a story to them until their breathing slowed. Sophie hummed softly, the melody carrying across the room, filling the quiet with something that felt almost like peace. Jackson sat opposite her, the fire casting his face in light and shadow. He studied Sophie, not in the way of a man appraising beauty, but as one who recognized strength. She had endured hunger, cold, judgment from the world, and yet she sat there with her back straight, her children safe in her care. He respected her deeply, though he did not yet know how to say it. Sophie felt his gaze and looked up, meeting his eyes across the fire. For a moment neither spoke. The storm howled outside, the wind rattling the shutters, but inside there was only warmth. She lowered her eyes quickly, a flush rising in her cheeks. The guilt returned. Guilt for feeling gratitude toward another man when once she had promised her life to Daniel. But as she watched Clara, Rose, and Tommy sleep soundly for the first time in days, she whispered a prayer of thanks. Even if her heart was torn. "Storm will keep us in for a while," Jackson said at last, his voice low and steady. Sophie nodded, her fingers brushing absently against the sewing in her lap. "Then perhaps it's a blessing," she murmured. Jackson leaned back in his chair, his eyes lingering on the children. "Maybe it is." Outside, the snow piled higher, sealing them off from the world. Inside, something fragile yet undeniable began to take root. A bond born not of choice but of need, of hunger and shelter, of loneliness met by loneliness. And though neither dared speak of it, both Sophie and Jackson felt the quiet truth settle between them like a secret. Perhaps the storm had not trapped them, but brought them together. When the storm finally broke, the world emerged beneath a clean white blanket. The snow glistened under the pale winter sun, fences bowed beneath the weight, and the road into town was little more than a narrow track carved by wagon wheels. Jackson hitched his team to the sled, intending to fetch supplies. Sophie had offered to go instead, but he refused. He didn't want her braving the cold or the stares he knew would follow. Yet the town of Dry Creek had eyes, and tongues sharper than barbed wire. By the time Jackson stepped into the general store, Sophie's presence at his ranch had already become talk. "Did you hear? Widow Harper's been holed up at Jackson Cole's place all through the storm," whispered a woman by the bolts of fabric. "Holed up?" her companion scoffed. "More like settling in. A woman doesn't stay with a man under his roof unless she means to." Behind the counter, Mr. Davies raised his brows as Jackson placed flour, sugar, and coffee on the counter. "You've had company, I hear," he said, his tone mild but his eyes sharp. "Widow and her young ones. Folks been talking." Jackson kept his jaw tight, his voice even. "Storm caught him. I gave him shelter. That's all." Davies smirked, weighing out the flour. "That ain't how folks see it." By the time Jackson returned to the ranch, the whispers had already reached Sophie. Clara had overheard two women in town speaking when she went with Sophie to fetch water from the well. Their words had been cruel, suggesting Sophie had thrown herself into another man's arms out of desperation. That evening, Sophie sat by the fire with her sewing untouched in her lap. Her children played quietly, but her mind was elsewhere. She could feel the invisible weight of judgment pressing against the cabin walls. She had come to Jackson's door for bread, not scandal, and yet scandal had followed her anyway. She looked at Jackson as he tended the fire, his broad back to her, and her chest ached with guilt. His reputation, once one of stoic respect, was being tarnished because of her. He had taken them in with nothing but kindness, and she repaid him with gossip that clung like mud. That night, after the children had fallen asleep, Sophie rose quietly. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, slipped her ring back into her pocket, and pulled on her boots. Her heart pounded as she moved toward the door. She told herself she had to leave, for Jackson's sake, if not her own. But the floorboards creaked and Jackson turned. His shadow loomed in the firelight, his eyes catching hers with a sharpness that froze her in place. "Where are you going?" His voice was low but steady. She drew in a shaky breath. "I can't stay, Jackson. People are talking. About me, about you. I won't ruin your name." He stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "You think I care about gossip?" "You should," Sophie whispered fiercely, tears burning her eyes. "You've lived here all your life. People respect you. And now they'll say you took in a woman for reasons that aren't true. They'll say my children have no shame living under your roof without a name to protect them." Jackson's jaw clenched. He studied her, the firelight flickering across his weathered face. "Let them talk," he said finally. "I didn't take you in to please the town. I took you in because you were starving. Because those children deserve to sleep warm and fed. And because," he paused, his throat tight, "because no one should face this life alone." Her hand trembled on the door latch. "But I have nothing to give you. No land, no money, not even my pride. All I have is this ring, and even that I meant to sell." Jackson reached out, gently closing his calloused hand over hers, pulling it away from the latch. His voice softened. "What you've given me already is more than you know." She stared at him, confused. "Laughter," he said simply, glancing toward the children asleep on the pallet. "A house that doesn't echo. A reason to come home at night. That's worth more than gold to me." The tears she had held back spilled over. Her body shook as she lowered her head, torn between gratitude and shame. Jackson didn't release her hand. Instead, he guided her back to the chair by the fire. "You and the children are safe here," he said firmly. "No one's running you off. Not even you." Sophie sat, her shawl pulled tight, heart pounding in her chest. For the first time since Daniel's death, she felt not just sheltered but seen. And though the storm outside had passed, she knew another raged in town. Yet sitting there, with Jackson's steady presence filling the silence, she realized she could endure it. Because he was right. The children were safe, and for the first time in years, so was she. The days stretched into weeks, and slowly the ranch began to change. At first, Sophie insisted she and the children would stay only until she could find work or another place to live. But Jackson, steady and practical, had looked her in the eye one morning after breakfast and said, "You've got no place else to go, and I've got more land and chores than one man can manage. Stay, not as charity but as partners. The word settled in Sophie's heart with surprising weight. Partners. Not beggars, not boarders, not mouths to feed. He was offering them a role, a purpose, a share of the life he had built with his own 2 hands. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was taking. She felt like she was building something again. From then on, the ranch thrummed with new energy. Sophie rose at dawn with Jackson, tying her hair back and pulling on boots far too big for her, yet walking into the morning air as though she had always belonged. She learned to gather eggs from the henhouse, her laughter ringing across the yard when the hens scolded her clumsy hands. She split wood at his side, her cheeks flushed with the effort, refusing to let him think her weak. When she cooked, she used what little they had with care, turning simple beans and bread into meals that warmed more than their stomachs. Clara, ever serious, took to the horses. Jackson showed her how to place a saddle, how to sit tall, how to hold the reins with both firmness and gentleness. The first time she rode across the pasture, her hair flying behind her and her face alight with joy, Sophie watched with tears in her eyes. Clara was still a child, no matter how much responsibility she carried, and here she was allowed to be one again. Rose, delicate and dreamy, found her place in the barn. Jackson taught her to milk the old cow, Daisy, who tolerated the girl's small, careful hands better than most. Rose hummed to the animal while she worked, her sweet voice filling the stalls like sunlight breaking through clouds. Each morning she carried the milk pail into the kitchen with pride, declaring, "Look, Mama, I helped." And Sophie would kiss her brow, whispering thanks for the hope in her daughter's eyes. Tommy, the youngest, was Jackson's shadow. Wherever the rancher went, the boy followed, whether fixing fence posts, feeding chickens, or hauling water. Jackson bore it with patience, answering the boy's endless questions, letting him hold nails or pat the horses. Sometimes, when Tommy fell asleep in the hayloft, Jackson carried him inside, the child's head resting on his shoulder. It had been years since he'd held anyone so small, and the feel of it stirred something deep in him, something tender he thought had died with his parents. As the ranch bustled with new life, so too did Jackson's spirit. His days were no longer filled with silence but with voices. Sophie's gentle instructions to her children, Clara's laughter, Rose's singing, Tommy's chatter. Evenings by the fire were no longer lonely. He found himself looking forward to Sophie's presence, to the quiet strength she carried, to the way her eyes softened when she thought no one noticed. And Sophie, for her part, felt a slow shift in her heart. She had come to the ranch desperate, ring in hand, ready to trade the last piece of her old life for a loaf of bread. Now she stood in the kitchen kneading dough while Jackson chopped wood outside, her children's voices ringing through the yard, and for the first time in years she felt something she had not dared to feel, hope for tomorrow. Respect grew between them first, stronger than the rumors of town, stronger than the doubts that still whispered in Sophie's mind. She respected the way Jackson worked without complaint, the way he never treated her like a burden, the way he looked at her children as though they were his own. Jackson respected Sophie's courage, her willingness to rise each day and meet hardship head-on, her determination to carry dignity, even in the face of loss. Affection followed, quietly. Not in grand gestures, not in stolen embraces, but in the small things. Jackson saving the softest piece of bread for Sophie's plate, Sophie stitching the tear in his work shirt with hands that trembled just slightly. In the hush of the evening, when their eyes met across the firelight, there was something unspoken there, fragile and steady. The ranch had once been a place of silence and ghosts. Now it was filled with laughter, with footsteps, with the warmth of life returning. Jackson had given Sophie and her children a home. In return, they had given him something he thought he would never have again: family. Spring thaw came slowly to the plains. Snow melted into muddy rivulets that carved through the earth, and the pastures began to show hints of green. The ranch, once buried beneath silence, now stirred with life. Hens clucked, horses stamped, children's laughter carried on the breeze. For Sophie, each day felt like a fragile miracle, as though the world was finally giving her a second chance. But shadows have a way of returning, even in spring. It began with whispers in town. Clara, sent with Jackson to the mercantile, overheard men talking about a stranger asking questions about the widow Harper. By the time the wagon rattled back to the ranch, Sophie's heart sank with dread. She knew who it had to be, her late husband's brother, Henry Harper. Henry arrived 2 days later, riding hard into the yard as though the ranch belonged to him. He was broad like Daniel had been, but without the warmth. His eyes were cold, his mouth set in a line that spoke of entitlement rather than care. He dismounted with a heavy thud, his boots crunching the dirt, and called out before even reaching the porch. "Sophie," his voice was sharp, commanding. "You've no business keeping those children out here. They're Harper's, and I'll not see them raised in another man's house." The children froze where they were playing by the fence. Clara stepped in front of Rose and Tommy instinctively, her small shoulders squared. Sophie emerged from the doorway, her shawl clutched tight, her face pale. She had known this moment might come, but the sight of Henry still struck terror into her chest. "They're my children, Henry," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I've cared for them since Daniel passed." Henry's lip curled. "You call this care? Living off the charity of Jackson Cole? Folks in town say you've lost your pride hiding under his roof. Those kids need a proper family, and I intend to take them in." Before Sophie could reply, Jackson stepped out behind her. His presence filled the porch, broad, steady, his eyes narrowed in quiet warning. He descended the steps slowly, placing himself between Sophie and Henry. "They're not going anywhere," Jackson said evenly. Henry scoffed. "And who are you to say so? They're blood and you're nothing. You think feeding them a few meals makes you their father?" Jackson's jaw tightened. He didn't raise his voice, but the steel in it was clear. "I don't claim to be their father, but I'll tell you what I am. I'm the man who opened his door when they were starving. I'm the man who saw a mother try to sell her wedding ring just to keep her babies alive. And I'm the man who'll fight before he lets you tear apart the home they've begun to build here." Henry's eyes flashed with anger. "You've no right." The law? Jackson cut him off. "The law ain't here. What's here is this ranch, this family, and me standing in your way. If you want to take them, you'll have to go through me." The yard fell silent, only the wind moving through the grass. Sophie's heart pounded so hard she thought it might break. She had lived in fear of this moment, certain that Henry would claim her children and leave her empty-handed. But now, watching Jackson stand unshaken between them, she felt something stronger than fear. She felt protected. Henry glanced past Jackson to Sophie, his expression twisting with disdain. "So this is what you've become? A widow who clings to another man's charity?" Sophie swallowed, her hands trembling, but she lifted her chin. "No, I'm a mother who chose to survive, and I'll not let you shame me for it." Her voice surprised even herself. The children huddled close behind her, and in their wide eyes she saw pride. For once she wasn't just enduring, she was standing. Henry spat in the dirt, his anger simmering. But something in Jackson's stance told him the fight wasn't worth it. With a growl, he swung back onto his horse. "This ain't over," he warned. Then he rode out, dust rising in his wake. In the days that followed, word of the confrontation spread through Dry Creek. At first, the same old whispers stirred, questions about Sophie's place in Jackson's home. But now the story was different. People spoke of the widow who had stood her ground, of Jackson Cole who had defended her honor without hesitation. Respect, slow and reluctant, began to take root. At church, neighbors nodded to Sophie instead of turning away. Children invited Clara, Rose, and Tommy to play without sneers, and though gossip never truly died, it no longer carried the same sting. One evening, as the sun set over the prairie, Sophie sat on the porch beside Jackson. The children played in the yard, their laughter floating on the breeze. She looked at the man who had defended her, who had given her and her children not just food and shelter, but a chance at dignity again. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft but steady. Jackson didn't look at her. His gaze remained on the horizon. "You don't need to thank me, Sophie. This is your home now. No one's taking that from you." For the first time, Sophie allowed herself to believe him. The summer heat came sudden and sharp that year. By July, the prairie grass lay brittle and dry, crunching underfoot like old parchment. Even the cattle seemed uneasy, their tails swishing against flies in restless rhythm. Jackson watched the horizon daily, wary of the one enemy the land feared above all others: fire. It came one evening with the setting sun. A faint orange glow flickered against the distant hills, and the wind carried the unmistakable scent of smoke. Jackson was in the barn when Clara came running, her voice shrill with fear. "Mr. Jackson, look," he rushed outside. Across the horizon, a line of fire devoured the dry grass, rolling forward like a living beast. The wind pushed it toward the ranch, its roar growing louder with every gust. Jackson's heart hammered, but his mind snapped into action. Get the buckets, Clara. Rose, fetch blankets. Sophie, keep the children close. There was no time for panic. Jackson sprinted to the well, filling the first bucket and tossing water across the porch and fence posts. Clara followed without hesitation, her small frame determined as she hauled water alongside him. Rose stumbled with the heavy blankets, but Sophie caught them, dragging the cloths to the trough to soak them through. Flames crept closer, sparks flying on the wind, landing on the dry grass near the barn. Jackson swore under his breath, sprinting to beat them back. He stomped at the fire with wet burlap, the heat blistering his skin. Jackson! Sophie's voice cut through the roar. He turned. Tommy had wandered toward the pasture, drawn by the noise, his small figure silhouetted against the rising fire. Sophie bolted after him, her skirts tangling around her legs, but she didn't slow. She scooped the boy into her arms just as sparks rained down around them. Jackson's chest seized with terror. He sprinted to her side, throwing his soaked blanket over them both, shielding them from the burning cinders. Sophie clutched Tommy tight, her face grim but steady. You shouldn't, he started. There wasn't time to wait. She snapped, coughing against the smoke. Her eyes blazed brighter than the fire itself. He's my son. I'll run through hell itself for him. The words hit Jackson harder than the heat. In that instant, he saw not just desperation but courage. The fierce kind born from love, the kind that refused to yield even when the world burned. Together they raced back toward the ranch house, Sophie holding Tommy while Jackson beat at the flames, snapping at their heels. For hours they fought side by side, buckets passing hand to hand, blankets flung over smoldering grass, prayers whispered through smoke-filled throats. Clara and Rose worked as hard as their small bodies allowed, determined to save the place that had become their home. And though the fire raged, the ranch stood its ground. By dawn, the flames had passed, leaving only blackened fields and the acrid smell of ash behind. Exhausted, Sophie sank to the porch steps, her arms wrapped around Tommy, who had cried himself to sleep against her chest. Clara leaned against her mother's side, eyes heavy, while Rose curled up on the steps, soot smudging her face. Jackson lowered himself beside them, his shirt torn, his hands blistered, every muscle aching. For a long moment there was only silence, broken by the children's soft breathing. Then he turned to Sophie. You were brave tonight, he said quietly. She shook her head. I was terrified. Courage ain't the absence of fear, Jackson replied, his voice rough. It's what you do despite it. You saved him, Sophie. You saved all of them. Her eyes met his in the pale light of dawn. Ash clung to her hair. Soot streaked her cheeks, but to Jackson she had never looked more beautiful. The woman who had once stood on his porch with hunger in her eyes was now a warrior, fierce and unyielding. I couldn't have done it alone, she whispered. He nodded slowly, his gaze steady. You'll never have to. Not again. The words lingered between them, heavier than any vow. Sophie's breath caught and she looked away, though a small, tremulous smile curved her lips. Jackson's heart thudded in his chest, and for once he didn't fight it. I don't have pretty words, he admitted softly, his eyes still on her. But I'll say this plain. You and those children, you're more than guests here. You're my family now, if you'll have me. Her eyes filled with tears, but they were not of sorrow. She reached for his hand, her fingers trembling as they laced with his. We already are, she said. And as the sun rose over the charred fields, its light broke across the ranch in golden beams, falling on a family forged not by blood, but by fire. Winter loosened its grip at last. The snow melted from the rooftops, dripping into eager rivulets that carried away the last traces of cold. The prairie turned soft beneath the sun, fields greening again with fresh promise. Calves kicked their legs in the pasture, and wildflowers began to scatter color across the land. Renewal was everywhere, undeniable, unstoppable, beautiful. For Sophie, it was more than just another season. It was a rebirth. When she first arrived at Jackson's ranch, she had been hollowed by grief and hunger, her life stripped to desperation. But the months had changed her. She no longer saw herself as a widow living in the shadow of loss. She was a woman building a future, a mother watching her children thrive again, a partner standing shoulder to shoulder with a man who had proven his heart through action more than words. Each morning, she woke to the sounds of her children's laughter rather than their cries of hunger. Clara had grown taller, stronger, her once weary face now bright with purpose. She rode horseback with a confidence that made Jackson smile with pride. Rose, delicate and fragile through the long winter, had blossomed into health, humming softly as she gathered eggs from the hens. Tommy, ever full of mischief, had attached himself to Jackson as though the man were a second shadow, trailing him through the barns, the fields, even the forge where Jackson worked long into the evenings. The ranch had become more than shelter. It was home. One afternoon, with spring sunlight spilling over the yard, Jackson called Sophie to the barn. She wiped her hands on her apron, half smiling at his mysterious tone. Inside, the air smelled of warm iron and ash. On a small wooden table lay a box, plain but carefully made. "What's this?" she asked, her brow furrowed. Jackson rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly awkward, his rugged composure faltering. "Something I've been working on. Not much compared to what you deserve, but it's honest." He opened the box. Inside lay a simple band of silver, forged smooth by his own hands. It gleamed softly in the slanting light. Sophie's breath caught. She hadn't expected jewels or finery. She had long since ceased dreaming of such things. But the ring before her was something more precious. It was real. A piece of Jackson himself. "I ain't a man of speeches," Jackson said, his voice low, steady. "But I know what I want, Sophie. I want you. Not just in my house, not just for the children's sake. I want you as my wife, not because you need a place. Because I need you. You and me, we've both carried loneliness long enough. I reckon it's time we lay it down." Tears blurred Sophie's vision. For years, she had carried the weight of survival, of shame, of loss. She had stood on his porch months ago, trembling, offering to sell her wedding ring to keep her children alive. That ring had been her last link to Daniel, a memory both precious and painful. To part with it would have been to admit she had nothing left. Now another man stood before her, not asking her to give up but to begin again. She touched the ring gently, her fingers trembling. "You forged this yourself?" Jackson nodded. "Every bit of it. Took me longer than I'd like to admit." His lips twitched into a faint smile. "Guess I was nervous." A soft laugh escaped her through the tears. She lifted her eyes to him, her voice thick with emotion. "Jackson, I never thought I'd have a choice again. I thought my story ended with Daniel's death. But you've given me more than a roof and food. You've given me hope, a future, and yes, I'll marry you." The relief in Jackson's eyes was quiet but profound. He slipped the ring onto her finger, his calloused hands brushing against hers with surprising gentleness. The fit was perfect, as though it had always been meant for her. Outside, the sound of children's laughter broke through the stillness. Clara was chasing Rose through the tall grass while Tommy rolled down a gentle slope, squealing with joy. Their voices rang across the ranch like a hymn of life renewed. Sophie turned to look at them, her heart swelling until it felt too full for her chest. The sight was everything she had once prayed for but never believed she'd see again. Her children free, safe, happy. She looked back at Jackson, and for a moment words failed her. All she could do was stand in the golden light, her new wedding band catching the sun, tears of gratitude and love shining in her eyes. Jackson, never one for speeches, simply squeezed her hand. His silence said more than words ever could. Together they stepped out into the yard. Clara spotted them first, her grin wide as she ran to her mother. Rose and Tommy followed, tumbling over each other in their haste. "Ma," Clara cried, her eyes darting to Sophie's hand. Is that a ring?" Sophie knelt, drawing all three children close. "It is," she said softly, glancing up at Jackson. "It means we're a family now, not just in our hearts, but in name." The children erupted in cheers, hugging both Sophie and Jackson with arms sticky from play. Jackson chuckled, scooping Tommy up onto his shoulders while Clara and Rose clung to Sophie's sides. The prairie wind carried the sound of their laughter far across the fields, a sound of joy that seemed to echo against the horizon itself. For Sophie, it felt like the closing of one chapter and the bright beginning of another. No longer was she the widow who had come to a stranger's door in desperation. She was a wife again, a mother with renewed strength, a woman who had found love not in the ashes of her past, but in the promise of her present. And as the sun sank lower, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, she stood with her children and the man she now called her husband, feeling at last that her place in the world was secure. Once, she had tried to sell her wedding ring for bread. Now she wore a new one, not out of desperation, but out of love.